What do you want to do, Mitch? You're the station manager of NCPR. You can do whatever you want to do.
All the perks of being a public radio.
All the perks of being a public radio Don. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Living Writers Series. Thanks for coming out. My name is Phil LaMarche, and I'm the director of the Living Writers Series and an associate professor here at SUNY Canton in the Department of English and Humanities. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you again for coming out and remind everyone that this is a great time to silence your cell phones. If someone in the back could also maybe kick the door out and close the door so we don't get any... So the Living Writers Series is a group effort. There's a lot of folks that chip in to help make this possible, and I'd like to take this time to thank a few organizations and individuals. I'd like to thank the Canton College Foundation, the SUNY Canton offices of the President and the Provost, the SUNY Canton Student Government Association, the School of Business and Liberal Arts, the SUNY Canton Public Relations Department, the Department of English and Humanities, as well as our many private donors. I'm very excited about tonight's author, Chris Fink, who will be reading from his new story collection, Add This to the List of Things That You Are. And I'm also excited about a new format that we've been working on this semester. And after Chris reads some of his work, he'll be joined by Mitch Tyke for an onstage interview and a question and answer session with the audience. Mitch Tyke recently became the station manager at North Country Public Radio, returning to the North Country, where he worked as a reporter in the late 1990s. For the last 13 years, he interviewed literally thousands of people, from writers to musicians to designated hitters, in his work as executive producer and co-host of Lake Effect, the daily interview show at Milwaukee Public Radio. His radio career has also included time as a news director in Arizona and reporting stints in Minnesota and Iowa. We're very excited about this new partnership with Mitch and NCPR, and we'd like to welcome him to SUNY Canton in the Living Writers Series. Tonight's author, Chris Fink. I'd just like to say before I get into the whole formal introduction, I've known Chris since I think, was it 2005? We met at a writing conference in St. Petersburg, Russia. And we got put up in this apartment that the only hot water that the apartment had, you got this little like electrode that you stuck in a bowl of cold water, and then magically the current running through the electricity would warm the water. That was to give you an idea of what kind of apartment we were staying in. The only night, and then was it you that went in and like went to the wrong door and got yelled at by an old Russian man? So it was kind of a haphazard place to stay. The one cool thing about it was that we were overlooking the market that took place, that was Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. Like the final scene in Crime and Punishment took place in this market that our windows overlooked. It was kind of amazing. And every night at the end of the conference leaders would get up and they'd say to all of us, they'd say, now whatever you do, please don't go out tonight to the dacha. Now the dacha was like a bar / kind of nightclub, right? And they'd always tell us how dangerous it was there, how people often got held up by the police and by other nefarious people of the night. And of course, like good writers, right? Where did we go every night? We went to the dacha, right? And when you see Chris come up, you'll see, like when you're in a dangerous place, if you're in like Russia and you're going to a dangerous bar in a dangerous part of town, it's really good to have a tall Midwestern guy next to you, right? So he was a real valued asset over there. So Chris Fink is, on top of being my bodyguard in Russia, he is also the author of 2 short story collections, Farmer's Almanac, and Add This to the List of Things That You Are, that we've been reading in my class. He is the professor of English and Environmental Studies at Beloit College and editor-in-chief of the Beloit Fiction Journal. He is also a regular contributor to Northern Public Radio, where he produces monthly radio essays about the intersection of the self and natural world. A journal editor for more than 20 years, Fink founded 2 national short story prizes, the John Steinbeck Award and the Hamlin Garland Award. Recent stories of his have appeared in the Mississippi Review, the New Orleans Reviewand Witness. He was a founding faculty member of the MFA program at San Jose State University, where he taught for 5 years and edited Read magazine. He is a recipient of the 2003 Silicon Valley Artist Grant and founder of the John Steinbeck Award for the short story. In a time of increasing ideological polarity, Chris's work exists in kind of the bombed-out craters of no man's land, between left and right, watching the bombs bursting in midair and marveling at both the horror and the beauty of it. We've had a great time reading his stories in class, and we're really looking forward to hearing him read them to us tonight. Please help me welcome Chris Fink.
Thank you, Phil. You know, introducer at these events has a hard job. You have to make the writer, introducer's perennial job is to make the writer sound better than they are, which is often a hard job. I mean, Phil's had to introduce George Saunders and Mary Carr. Might not have been so hard tonight, but thank you, Phil. Thanks, everyone, for coming. It's a great series you have here, my second visit. I came here after my first book, Farmer's Almanac, was published. I think it was around 2013. So it's a great series. They're really lucky to have so many great writers come through here and to have Phil and now Mitch helping to run the series. So how many people are in Phil LaMarche's class? Raise your hand. Great. Yeah, you're so lucky to have a talented writer and professor like Phil. And thank you for inviting me. And thank you all for coming. So I flew in from Wisconsin yesterday, southern Wisconsin, not too much different than the landscape here of northern New York. Lots of agriculture, some old dairy farms. My first book was set in southern Wisconsin. It was called Farmer's Almanac, sort of rural characters in a fictional county in Wisconsin I called Odette County. The second book is similar characters, rural Midwestern characters, but I put them in more exotic locales. So Midwesterners abroad, I think of it as. Most of the stories take place in exotic places like California and New Zealand, and the one I'm going to read for you tonight takes place in Chicago. So the story kind of examines the urban-rural divide in America, which I think is somewhat in the news. I think you have reporters from Huffington Post and other places traveling around to find people with pickup trucks and see what real Americans are doing nowadays. So inasmuch as that my fiction is de rigueur, I think it's maybe about that intersection between urban and rural. So most of these characters are rural folks who are in more urban and urbane situations, and they usually find themselves out of place. The story I'm going to read for you is called Cubness. It's about the Chicago Cubs. It's a baseball story, but it's also a war story, and I promise it won't be too boring, even if you don't like baseball. At least I'll try not to make it too boring. I'm sort of fascinated by and really afraid of failure, which I think is why I've always been a Cubs fan. I'm not a big baseball fan, but I'm interested in failure and terrified of it personally. And for many years, the Cubs and the Red Sox were my two favorite teams. And they started winning, and they became less interesting to me. So I started writing this story about the Cubs in 2016, and I thought, well, I could write a story about the ultimate losers, the Cubs. And then that year, they won the World Series and wrecked my story. And so I thought, well, I'll have to make it a historical fiction. So this is a story, it's called Cubness, and it takes place in 2006 when the Cubs still sucked. Okay? Any baseball fans out there? Raise your hands. Few. Cubs? Anybody like the Cubs? Red Sox? Yeah. New York teams, maybe. Okay. So I'm going to read just part of this story. It's kind of a dark story. People say, why are your stories so dark? And you have to have conflict, I think, to have a story, so there's always some conflict. And then as I told you, I'm interested in these darker subjects. So these are some a group of friends from a rural place who go to a Cubs game together every year. And the perspective is it's a unified first-person perspective. So it's a we voice, what's sometimes called the hive mind. So there's one voice speaking for this group of friends. And the story Cubness has epigraph from the Chicago Tribune writer Mike Royko, who is a much beloved journalist and columnist and wrote about the Cubs for many years. He's since passed away. And Mike Royko writes, "I always believed that being a Cubs fan built strong character. It taught a person that if you try hard enough and long enough, you'll still lose. And that's the story of life." It's supposed to be funny. All right. How many people have ever heard the term New York City-it? Raise your hand. A few of you. So I teach at this little college in Wisconsin, but we get students from all over the country, and I had a student from New Hampshire who used that term. "Oh, we have these New York City-its." I'm like, "Oh, I love that term. I never heard of it." And I'm like, we don't have New York City to kick around in rural Wisconsin, but we do have a city, Chicago, fairly close by. So I thought, well, City-it would work for Chicago. So this the idea for this story came from that young woman from New Hampshire who used the term New York City-it. Where we're from, we have this saying, "Happiness is Chicago in the rearview mirror." Each of us has been heard saying this. We like to make fun of the people of Chicago and call them city-its because they can't change their own oil or plumb their own sinks. Of course, when our friend from Chicago invites us to the city, we're the first to go. And we always take cash out of the bank and big bills. And in Chicago, we appear to spend it freely because we don't want to look like cheap hicks to the people of Chicago. But it hurts us. Each 20 peeled from our rolls and blown in the windy city of Chicago hurts us, though we don't make it known. The reason we go to Chicago is to see the Chicago Cubs play baseball on Wrigley Field. Somehow the Cubs belong to us, even though we don't belong to Chicago, and all the things that we revile about Chicago do not apply to the Chicago Cubs. We usually go twice per year, once in the spring when the season is full of hope, and once in late summer when the season has been pissed away and all hope is lost. Most of us don't think about a Chicago Cubs game as a thing we would like to do. None of us would put a Cubs game on the calendar, and none of us would get on StubHub and pay $80 for a ticket. But when our friend from Chicago calls in August, like he does every August, and says he has extra tickets and he got them free, so don't worry, we're the first to accept. After we accept, we think of the misery of driving to Chicago and finding a place to park and forking over $50 just for a parking spot. We think about the awful crowds and the bodies crammed into small spaces. Granted, we think about the beautiful bodies of women we'll see who are somehow baseball fans. But we think more about $100 bills shrinking into $20 bills, and we can see ourselves peeling those bills and handing them over like singles for rounds of beer and soft pretzels, and later for cab rides and more rounds of beer and a burrito as big as our heads. We can actually picture the 20s peeling off like that and our rolls diminished. It makes us sick to think we'll act bigger than we are, and they will come home poorer than we were. We think about that whole day gone and what we'll be trading it for, and will it be worth it? We think about how much beer we'll consume and how we'll feel the next day. We think we would rather go get the boat out or maybe catch up on yard work or stay in bed all morning for once with our wives or get the wood pile where it needs to be. But we accept the tickets because we feel the pull of Chicago as a place we should want to live, even though we were smart enough never to have been suckered into living there. Chicago is a death sentence we have until this fateful summer in the year of our Lord, Jesus Christ, 2006, avoided. After we accept the tickets for the next weekend's game, we spend the week regretting our decision. We complain to our wives, and when our wives say, "Just stay home if you're going to hate it so much," we get angry with our wives that our wives don't understand us and never even seem to want to try. We love our wives, we do, but we tell ourselves that a day in Chicago away from our wives is just what we need if they're going to treat us this way. And so we go to Wrigley Field. Twice per year we go, and we've been going now for 2 decades and would probably continue to go if it weren't for the events of this upcoming game. Some of us hold a vague hope that something will happen to us at Wrigley Field, something improbable and memorable enough to talk about at work on Monday, or maybe even at future Cubs games. Others of us think the key to happiness is never to expect anything to happen, ever. None of us in our small hayfield brains can begin to fathom the events that will occur later that drunken afternoon just beyond the friendly confines of Wrigley Field. We are farmers and contractors and small business owners, and one of us is even a teacher, and one of us is a union slug. One of us was the valedictorian of our class, and one of us flunked out but later got an advanced degree. One of us is a veteran of the Iraq campaigns and has just been discharged after 2 decades in the military. This game, in fact, is a celebration of TK's discharge, or it happens to coincide with his discharge, whichever. In high school, we were teammates on the best baseball team in recent school history. Yes, we led our team to the state playoffs for the first time in decades, where we were eliminated in round 1. For that reason, our names are still uttered around town, even by the younger generations. At school, our pictures still grace the trophy case along with the grass-stained baseball with all of our tiny signatures. We remain heroes of sorts, something for the younger generations to aspire to, and that responsibility binds us. When one of us shows up to a high school baseball game in our town, it's like Ernie Banks at Wrigley Field. Something like that. We're Lutheran, or we used to be, though one of us is Catholic but had to go to the church in the next town. We're white, each of us, though our friend who works for ComEd is some part Mexican, and his nickname Babosa is Mexican for slug. We're approaching middle age, or we've already arrived, though none of us can quite understand what that means. As younger men, we thought of middle age as the pathetic end of natural life. But now that we're knocking on the door of middle age, we don't feel completely dead. We're all straight, though some of us have experimented, and may continue to experiment, though none of us knows which one of us that might be, though we have our suspicions. If we talked about it, which we don't, our opinion would differ on whether occasionally sleeping with another man makes you gay. Our friend with the tickets is Jewish, though none of us knew any Jews growing up, and we knew exactly one black person who is now in prison, which some of us say just goes to show. Though we have a Jewish friend, we still don't know a single Muslim. TK, who fought in Desert Storm, has unified our low opinion of Muhammad's people. Each of us inherited the Cubs from our parents, who were also fans, and each of us understands, some more clearly than others, that childhood allegiances to friends, to sports teams, to religions, to implement manufacturers are the biggest predictor of adulthood allegiances. We're also beginning to understand that the lifelong allegiances can fray under pressure, or they can simply molder from disuse and inattention. With game day approaching, none of us wants to drive, though each one of us has an SUV big enough for the 5 of us, except for the teacher, whose name is Jody, who of course drives a rice burner. One of us finally agrees to drive if he doesn't have to supply the beer for the ride. Agreed, we say. It is the same one of us who always agrees to drive. It is Delavan, who owns a small business selling ag byproducts nobody has ever heard of. Delavan is also a farmer, though that's just so he can collect the subsidies, we tease. Delavan drives to pick us up at our houses on Saturday morning, and we pick up TK last on account of his house is furthest east. TK we find standing at the end of his gravel driveway like a boy waiting for the school bus. His school uniform is digital camo and cubby blue, and his lunch bucket is an outsized red beer cooler. Some of us wonder why TK continues to wear the military issue, though none of us mentions it. Sup, N-words, TK says when he boards the bus. My N-word, Babosa says, taking the cooler from his hands. You can't say that, Jody says, and accepts a beer from the cooler. TK passes beers all around, and Delavan points the SUV toward Chicago. The 5 of us ride together to the game just as we did to our high school games, and the seating chart is even the same. Delavan at the helm and Mike Bell at his right hand. Mike Bell is a contractor who is really more of a roofer. In the back, TK and Babosa are separated by Jody, who is the closest thing we've got to a female and who therefore always rides bitch. At the game we attended in May, it was decided that this was the year for the Cubs, though by June it was decided that it might be next year. In July, the Cubs fired their skipper and started dumping contracts. Now it's August, and the Chicago Cubs have the worst record in all of baseball. Still, Wrigley Field promises to be sold out today. We always drink beers on our biannual sojourns to Wrigley Field. We remind ourselves about the old high school covenant, the D, or the driver's the drunkest. And we drink beers one after the other for the duration of the 2-hour ride into Wrigleyville. We drink so much beer that we must stop at the Belvedere Tollway Oasis and then at the Des Plaines Tollway Oasis to use the toilet. By the time we get to the Des Plaines Oasis, we're bleary and grinning. One of us says he's hungry for a Longa burger basket. Another of us says, Des Plaines, as if enjoying the taste of the words in his mouth. We load back into the SUV and pass out fresh beers and drive. The D, yo, one of us puts out and gets fist bumps in return. The trust that we have in our driver is unimpeachable, like a child's trust in his father. None of us suspects that our friend will careen off the interstate and manslaughter us or some other motorist, and indeed he does not. Our drunken savior, Delavan, keeps us safe for now. We are one unit as we hurtle in our SUV through the tollway corridor, past exits for towns that have become in our lifetime the exurbs, then past the western suburbs and into the near western suburbs. We are veterans of many campaigns to Wrigley Field. On the tollway, other SUVs and pickups full of men and boys head to Wrigley Field. The closer we get, the more the vehicles on the tollway seem like a convoy headed for a rendezvous. As we near our destination, the mood in the SUV becomes somber. The tightly wound orbit in which we travel is beginning to fray. It frays so gently, none of us even knows it's happening. This year, one of our wives will be born again. One of us will give his father his final shave. One of our daughters is pulling out all of her hair. One of us will find his brother hanging from a barn rafter. One of our wives is about to invite a friend into the bedroom. On the Kennedy Expressway, there are so many lanes of traffic, one of us tries to count them and has to start over. Each of us stares in wonder at the Chicago skyline as the Chicago skyline reveals itself. Now we can see the skyscrapers. There's the Standard Oil building, one of us thinks. Or maybe that's not it. There's the Sears Tower. Each of us is certain about that. On our fourth grade field trip, each of us went to the top of the Sears Tower, and none of us has been back since. Each of us is grateful to see the West Addison Street exit for Wrigley Field, for each of us, again, has to piss. If Wrigley Field is known as the confines, then what do we call the myriad streets and alleys radiating away from that old edifice? One of us is reminded of an old European quarter with passages and rows of merchandise and the hawkers and pushers, some holding fistfuls of money as they make confusing transactions with the hordes. Mike Bell peels $100 from his roll to pay for the slim gap in the alley where Delavan somehow squeezes his SUV. And though the slot is so narrow we can barely open our doors, we each manage to piss right there between the telephone poles and old garages of Wrigleyville. The old Polish woman who sells us the spot looks like a character from a fairy tale with her brown sweater and plaid headscarf. She makes change for Mike Bell, even while Mike Bell has one hand on his dick. We drain our beers and enter the mighty current that pulls us toward the ballpark. Arriving at Clark and Addison at the main Wrigley gates, some of us are surprised, even after so many arrivals, to see that the place exists in color. For we grew up watching the Cubs on black and white sets, and in our first 1,000 views of this fabled place, the shapely marquee that read Wrigley Field, home of the Chicago Cubs, was not brilliant red, but monochrome. One of us imagines the marquee as an alluring set of feminine lips. We stand before it with a few extra minutes on our hands, still time, thanks to Delavan's good driving, to dip into the Cubby Bear, where Jody breaks his first C note on a quick round of tall boys. In the Cubby Bear, our attention is captured by a dazzling 20-something couple. The man wears an orange tracksuit and aviator glasses, and the blonde beauty on his arm looks like an advertisement for this place. Her tight Cubs t-shirt looks painted on, and the bear cub on the logo of her snug team shorts seems to nuzzle the succulent cup of her buttocks. Her blonde hair she wears in a bun under a Cubs visor. There is little to suggest she belongs to the same species we do. The smear of eye black she wears under each eye is the proverbial frosting on the cake. Tell me a chick with eye black is not the sexiest thing you've ever seen, one of us says. We watch in amazement as orange tracksuit guides the Cub model into the men's John, past the line of men who are in fact waiting for the John. None of us can believe it when the door shuts behind them. Did you see that? We say to one another, and answer with the same question. Did you see that? In the time it takes us to finish our tall boys, the door opens again and the couple walks out, the line of waiting men parting for them. The Cub model's eye black looks streakier now, which is somehow even sexier, and her blonde bun looks must. Are we imagining this? Did orange tracksuit just wink at another dude in the line? Chicago is a difficult city to understand, we all agree, and the transactions that occur here mystify us. In our town, we would invite Orange Tracksuit to taste our pavement outside our local bar. In Chicago, he gets to F the hottest number in the place while everyone else stands around imagining it. Anything, it appears, is possible within the radiant halo of Wrigley Field. Back in the sunlit intersection of Clark and Addison, in the confusion and mayhem, the cabs honk and eddy. One nearly mows us down as we jaywalk across Addison. The cabbie is dark and turbaned and yells something at us in a language we cannot fathom. The sounds like bringing up phlegm from deep within and expelling the moistness toward us. One of us slaps the rear fender of the yellow beast as it rushes past. We barely register the calamity we just avoided before we pass beneath the glistening red marquee and Wrigley Field swallows us. The sun always shines on the left field bleachers at Wrigley Field, and it is shining hotly this day as we emerge from the stadium's bowels to search for our seats. The game is already underway, and one of us asks, "The fuck are the Cubs playing anyway?" And one of us answers, "The lowly Pods. We have, gentlemen, a puncher's chance." Of the five of us, only Barbosa is worth a shit at reading the tickets. As we wait, one of us licks a finger, holds it up, and announces the wind is indeed blowing out. Barbosa is triumphant, and he finds 5 empty seats in the middle of a row. There is our ticket patron, Simon, waving to us, and before we can even sit down next to him, the closest vendor yells, "Beer here." TK pulls a Franklin from his roll, hands it down the line, and 5 tall boys come back down the line toward our accepting arms. "Thanks for the tickets, hey, Simon," one of us says. "Free tickets, and they're still a ripoff." "Up yours," Simon says, giving us the finger. Then Simon says, "Hey, look who I found." At his right is a golden-haired young man in a camo Angels jersey, smiling like he knows us. He's the only person in the bleachers not wearing blue. It takes us a moment, but finally we recognize him as one of our own. Yes, he's from our town. Nice kid. Jen Phillips' little cousin Henry. A good ball player, too, we remember. "Hey, Henry," we all say. "TK fucked you, Henry," another one of us says, meaning Henry was shorted a beer. Henry, we remember, was like a dozen years behind us in school. Jin was in our class, though he rode the pine on our winning team. We give high fives to Simon and Henry. One of us went to college with Simon, and now he's our adopted Jewish Sidiot, an honorary member of our hometown who works at the Merc. He comes home to our town in the fall and shoots our deer from our shelter belts and carries back with him our venison and good oak firewood. In return, he furnishes us these bleacher seats and stock tips we rarely use. We are glad to have our own private Sidiot, Simon. We settle back and take in the expanse of the confines, the green perfection of the outfield grass, the impeccably raked diamond infield, the rows of box seats rising like galleries of a ship, up to the air-conditioned skyboxes where those rich pricks sit and palm their highballs. Down below us, the miniature ball players punch their gloves and hurl the pearl around the horn. Here is the oldest yard in the majors, bar 1, and we Bush League pals are among the thousands who brine the rim of it. Already we're more drunk than we've been in many weeks, and it's still the first inning, and first blood has not been scratched by either team. In the bottom of the second, the Cubs mount a threat, but the inning ends with our guy stranded at first and third. The Padres starter worked his ass out of a jam, and now this is now liable to settle down. Maddox is pitching for our guys. Yes, crafty old Maddox is back in Chi-Town for a swan song and tossing two-seamers at like 82. Please don't let this be a pitcher's duel, one of us says. We come to watch baseball, sure, but we also come to watch the young and the beautiful. For most everyone in the bleacher seats these days seems cast for the show. Looking out over the sea of young fans, one of us thinks of a saying he heard one time. What was it? Youth is the only thing worth having. In the top of the thirds, the Pods nick Maddox for a run on a bunt single, a stolen base, and a couple of groundouts. In the bottom of the inning, the Padres starter sets the Cubs down in order. Christ, one of us says, let's at least see a fly ball. The game is indeed shaping up to be a pitcher's duel despite the favorable wind. The outfielders for both teams blow bubbles and stretch their legs. With nothing much to see in the ball field, we concern ourselves with rounds of beer and trips to the head. We catch up with Henry and Simon. After high school, Henry did a hitch with the Navy, he tells us, but never left San Diego, what he called Operation Desert Vacation. Now he's back, living in Chicago, running trades on the floor of the Merc, where he met Simon, and taking classes nights in the GI Bill. Henry is a version of us, a dozen years newer. Here's a hometowner making a go of it in the city, though he is no citiot. Henry belongs in these bleachers in a way we do not. He's one of the young and the beautiful, sure, but he's one of ours too. He looks into our eyes when he talks to us and asks each of us about our wives and families. When Henry takes out his roll to pay for a round, one of us says, "Put that away." And we all say, "Yes, put that away, Henry." Henry is a handsome boy, one of us thinks. Though in your middle 20s, are you still a boy? Each of us finds himself wondering about Henry, the shiny new member of our team. What makes Henry so charming, one of us thinks, is that he shows a devotion we didn't earn. Henry saw our picture in the trophy case every day at school. We were the boys Henry grew up wanting to be. Do you ever outgrow that devotion? Most of Henry's attention seems directed at TK, which makes sense since they both share the military. Still, at least one of us wishes the seats were rearranged. "Beer here," calls the vendor. True to the spirit of Armed Forces Day, the rounds keep coming for TK. Drunken bleacher bums can't seem to thank him enough for his service to our country. 2 or 3 Cubs models ask to take selfies with TK, and we suddenly realize why he isn't wearing his civvies. Henry could cash in on this Support Our Troops Love Fest also, but he does not, even though he's sitting right beside TK talking about his discharge. We don't yet know the nature of his discharge. We tell ourselves that it's honorable, but we confess to our wives that we're not sure. By the 4th inning, the beer doesn't even want to loiter in our bladders before demanding release. One of us leans forward, unzips, and fills the very cup he just emptied. Behind our sunglasses, some of us close our eyes and nod off in the sun. We stir only when we hear the crack of a bat, and we stand and cheer, or else we boo. Behind our sunglasses, our heads swim and our moods turn sour. In between cracks of the bat and trips to the head, we dwell on the Cubs' sad state of being, what some of us think of as Cubness. It's not like us to dwell, but this is a battle of cellar dwellers after all, and a pitcher's duel to boot. No fan from anywhere can quite understand what it's like to reside in these bleachers. This is Cubness. Here we are, and we don't quite understand it ourselves. If you root for another team, you can always console yourself by thinking back to the glory days when your team brought home the World Series trophy. With the Chicago Cubs, that was generations ago. Our dads weren't even alive back in that day. Our granddads and their dads were born into this ancient losing streak. In the 5th inning, it's still 1-0, and Maddox is dealing like the Maddox of old, nibbling at the corners, changing speeds just perceptibly. Maddox is a pitcher that our fathers deeply admired, a bridge of our generations. "That old fucker still owns the plate," one of us says. Delvin breaks a C-note for a round. Henry is still chatting with TK. All smiles and gestures suggest he's telling TK a happy story. It's strange to have Henry out here with us. These biannual trips and this stupefying drunkenness are routine. But Henry is a newness we did not expect. In the bottom of the 5th, or maybe it's the 6th, the Pod Scotch and other Cubs rally. Cubs' next white hope, Burton, K's on a hanging slider to end the threat. Sosa would have gone yard on that pitch, one of us says. Skipping ahead here. A most thunderous, deafening boom interrupts our musings, and we follow the eyes of our bleacher mates skyward. It's not so far past 9/11 that some of us don't still get nervous in a crowd in our major cities, especially when 3 fighter jets shatter the sound barrier just above our heads. There go the 3 Tomcats, or whatever they are. They've just buzzed our bleachers. What the hell? No, we are not being attacked. We are being invited to stretch, and we salute the members of our armed forces. It's the middle of the 7th, and there's John Fogerty hanging out of the announcer's booth to sing with us. A 1, a 2, a 3. We do sing. The bleachers are a sea of sloppy drunks, beer sloshed from the sonic boom, mascara running, buttons sprung, cleavages and crotches ripening in the sun. We're sodden and slurring, and we spill more beer and embrace each other, and we sing. One of us sings the lyrics from the forgotten verse. There isn't anyone else like me. Maybe I'll go down in history. We're triumphant and blissful, and none of us thinks about anything at all until we finish the song. And then we exhale and give some skin to our neighbors and settle back into our collective stupor. During the stretch, TK gets more attention. Fans fall all over themselves to shake his hand. Thank you for keeping us safe, the fans say, and ask for a selfie. Yes, everyone seems to want to suck TK's dick, especially the men. We're surprised that Henry tells us after the stretch that he has to go. Go in a cup, yo, one of us says. Fist bumps, more skin. Duty calls, Henry tells us. He's got a class tonight and has to go home to study. So long, Henry, each of us says. We bro hug him and give him skin and tell him we'll buy him a beer and the best shot next time he's in town. Yes, Henry could hold his own with the Citiots, and he could run the table back home, too. The Cubs might lose 100 games, but not our Henry. I'd like to get to know that kid better, more than one of us thinks. When he gets to the aisle, Henry looks back and gives us a big sweeping wave and a smile. He shoots TK a salute, and TK says, Cubs suck. Hey, anyone can have a bad century. Henry comes back. It sounds like he's quoting someone. One of his old naval officers, or maybe some Cubs legend of yore. We can't tell if he's serious or full of shit. In any case, those are his last words, and that's the last we ever see of him. None of us will ever get to know Henry any better than we already know him. The seventh inning is to a baseball game what early August is to summer. By the time August rolls around, you can kiss the summer goodbye, and likewise the ball game. After the stretch, everything rushes toward conclusion, and you had better drink up, yo, because they stop watering the bleachers in the middle of the eighth. Last call, shouts the vendor, and Jody peels 2 more 20s from his roll. Let these be the last, he thinks, and they are. So some bad things happened after that and after the ball game, but I'm going to leave that for next time. You can read on if you get the book. So that's all. Thank you very much. Now comes the hard part.
Now comes the easy part.
Okay.
And I can't tell, are our microphones on? Can you
Hello?
hear us?
Hello?
Oh, I can hear us now.
Yes, yes.
Well, Chris Fink, thank you so much for sharing this reading with us, and welcome back to the North Country.
Thank you. Thank you. Happy to be here.
Who are these people? I mean, besides the names of the people we've met in Cubness, who are these people that inhabit your stories, and what attracts you to these guys?
Well, I grew up in the rural Midwest, and I think that's where most of my characters come from. So people I know, combinations of characters, people sort of left out of the mainstream, people that some of you might recognize, or maybe you don't know, and you're meeting them for the first time. But definitely people that I recognize from my more from my youth. But I still live in a small town in Wisconsin, and see some of the people that inhabit. Some of the people like the characters that inhabit these pages every day. So.
You mentioned the rural-urban divide in your as you were kind of introducing this story, and I wonder if you think that maybe people don't give these guys enough credit, that we don't get to know them in a way that we know more typical heroes of stories.
Yeah. I think so. I mean, this has been one of the big questions since 2016. It's like, what's going on in rural America? What are these people thinking? And so there's been more interest in popular media in major cities about the mindset of working class, middle Americans, rural Americans. 2/3 of the country is still rural, but you wouldn't know that if you witnessed popular media.
Is it fair to call the people in these stories anti-heroes? Is that oversimplifying the thing?
I think it's fair. Yeah, I don't think of it in terms of that, in terms of literary terms when I'm making the story, but I suppose, I mean, they're not very heroic, they don't behave well, they behave badly, many of them. Some of them overcome their circumstances and have a moment of grace. And there is some redemption for some of these characters in the book. Not for the characters in that particular story. They sort of get what they deserve in a way. They're behaving badly, but there is redemption for some of the characters.
There's also kind of a transient nature to them when you take the stories as a whole. I mean, the snapshots of their lives that we're privy to, they're having some adjustment issues. So many of them are from someplace else and in a place they're not comfortable with.
Yeah. That was the sort of unifying idea for this book. So with a collection of short stories, you can't just have a bunch of stories you put between covers and say, here's my book. You have to somehow think of it as a book. I mean, the general reading public reads more novels, and I think publishers and readers in general want stories to seem like they have some common threads. So you're reading stories that were put together for a reason. And that was my idea, basically. Rural Midwesterners who are sort of flung off to faraway places. There's a book by Mark Twain called Innocents Abroad, in which he follows a group of Americans to the Holy Land, and that was sort of it's sort of a guiding theme here, sort of innocents abroad, rural Midwesterners in foreign climes.
I always wonder, when you're putting together a collection of short stories, is it like, if you're a musician, the idea that these stories need to go in a certain order to make sense to you as the writer, or how important is it to have one particular story following another particular story?
It's important to me. I did it quite intentionally. There's some give and take there with editors, but one of my colleagues got the book and he read the last story first. I was like, no, because the first story in the book and the last story are connected. They have the same main character, and reading that last story without the context of the first story, I think, in my mind, doesn't make it complete. But I'm sure the reader doesn't worry about that.
Well, and I don't know if anybody's still listening to CDs, but this is not a book that you want to read on shuffle mode, apparently.
Right.
I used the term snapshot before, and that kind of stuck out to me, actually, because I noticed at least 3 references to photography in these stories in this collection. Does photography hold a significant place in your life and your writing?
I think so. I used to got my start as a journalist before I got into to creative writing in academia, and most journalists have to be a jack of many trades, as you know. And so I had a little training in photography, and I had a camera when I started working for newspapers, but that made you a photographer. And so I was interested in that as an art form, and you don't want to have all your like most writers, I'm interested in art and aesthetics, and that sort of having photographer characters, I felt was a way to explore that.
I want to mention, by the way, that we're going to take your questions here in just a few minutes, but I have a couple more for you. And I guess, exploring photography as an art form, is there a commonality between like the selective image of a life that you get in a photograph and what you're able to show us of a life in a short story?
It's a great question. So some theorists of the short story, have compared short stories to photographs, actually, and this writer Julio Cortázar said that a short story is more like a photograph. It's a vertical form, whereas a novel is more like a film, which is a horizontal form. In this idea, and so a short story has to do its work, emotional work, pretty quickly, like a photograph does. And so I mentioned some of the photographic theory in one of the stories, but that it can't linger, right? So there's a great comparison between photography and short stories.
Well, and with a photograph, just like a short story, you can kind of stare at it for a while, and you can spend that amount of time with a short story as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'm really drawn to short forms. Other theorists have said that the short stories. People think of short stories as like, well, a novel's a long story and a short story is a shorter novel. But really, a short story is again not a mini novel, but really closer to a poem. Images are important. This sort of the scope has to be fairly narrow. This story I read takes place in an afternoon, so.
Well, and I remember an interview I did a few years ago. This is going to be the only name dropping I do, but with the Canadian short story writer Alexander MacLeod. And I think we batted around the idea that there are some luxuries in writing a short story, like luxuries of not having to explicitly tell us everything that's led to the characters doing what they do in the course of a book like a novel does. But those luxuries offer some challenges to the readers of short stories.
Yeah. I think short stories are sometimes hard to enter. You usually get dropped in someplace. There's a rule of thumb in short story writing, which is you're supposed to start as close to the action as possible. So you don't need to tell the story what the characters, were like as children, or so you want to start close to the action. And sometimes, just like it's hard to start a novel, and sometimes you have to read the first chapter a couple times to get into it, it can be, hard to get into a story, which I think is why maybe it's not quite as, the short story collection is not quite as popular as the novel form, because it's a little harder slog to get into it. Hopefully the payoff is worthwhile, but it's harder to get going.
Do you think short story writers pull the rug out from us readers more than novelists do?
Pull the rug out. Say more.
Well, I think, and you didn't read the end of Cubness, but I think of Cubness, and I think of a couple other stories in this book, and they're dark stories by their nature, but they also kind of show their darkness rapidly in a way that we don't always see coming in the same way we do with a novelist.
Yeah, that's a great point. If the story is any good, I mean, a lot of times you have to read it twice, but there should be clues in there. We like to be surprised. Readers are like people and children and animals. We all like to sort of sense of surprise. But we want to be surprised in a sense that's like a surprise, but then a sense of inevitability, not a surprise like, where the hell did that come from? So in that story, something bad happens at the end, but I tried to prepare the reader for that with small clues throughout the text. Whether that was successful is up to the reader, but that's what I was after.
I think I've been kept up late at night by short stories more than I have by novels. I mean, with novels, maybe I'm up late wanting to finish it because I have to keep reading it, but I think like the chilling aspect of a short story stays with me longer or longer into the night. Before we move on to questions from our audience tonight, I did want to ask you whether there is a particular kinship you feel with your writer character in the story Writer's Elbow. This is a guy who's got the summer off. He teaches at his local college in this case, and so he has the summer off, and it's a major victory for him when he manages just to take the garbage out.
Yeah.
I mean, is that the life of the life of a writer you're trying to share with us?
Yeah. Well, writers are sort of dilettantes, and I think in general, and when you're actively writing, you're living in your imagination a lot. So the daily, how do you do of daily living sometimes gets left aside. In that story, there's a sort of, I'm interested in this sort of instinct intellect, paradigm that you see oftentimes in literature and film. Characters that are driven by intellect, and then characters who are driven by instinct more. And that, that in that story, the wife is very practical-minded, makes lists, gets shit done, and the sort of writer's sort of philosophical thinker who's, not very productive in daily life. And so, I mean, sometimes it's hard to keep. I mean, you have to be a dreamer in a way to be a writer. You have to waste a lot of time. And then, people who aren't writers can see you wasting time, and this causes some conflicts.
Is email your worst enemy as a writer?
Email's not good. Yeah. I heard a podcast about, this was on NPR, about somebody thinking about, in 50 years as academics and intellectuals look back at this moment in history, one of the things they'll be dismayed by is how much time we waste on email. So, not a productive form of communication, according to the commentator.
Well, I don't want to waste anybody's time right now, so if you have questions, raise your hand, and I'm going to turn this microphone on and wade into the audience. And
maybe I'll stand up.
I was going to jump down from the stage,
Okay.
but then I thought maybe I would hurt myself, and that would be a bad way for this event to end.
So good evening, good sir. My name is Brian Knowles. I am a a student in Phil LaMarche's Living Writers Series class, and I'm actually planning on becoming a writer myself.
Good for you.
So what I wanted to ask you, seeing how your story seems to be focusing on excuse me. Let me see if I can try to get this right. Like not real city folk being thrown into rural situations. Have you ever thought of making stories outside of that, like maybe kind of expand into different topics, or do you feel like this is their comfort zone for you, and this is where you feel like this is the most comfortable writing stories?
Yeah, that's a great question. Comfort zone? I don't know if it's comfortable. As I was saying to Mitch, I think when you're working on something that you think is going to be a book, then you try to work on that one thing for a while. I was definitely sort of being intentional about the themes of some of the stories, though I think they're much different in the plots and the sort of scenarios and the settings are much different. So it doesn't feel necessarily comfortable to me to write that. But I would say that, as a writer, I think some people are trying to sort of sniff the zeitgeist and, see what's popular and to try to do that. And for me, it's like I write a lot of different things, but I try to do things that I can pull off, make feel authentic and real. The writer Flannery O'Connor said, you can choose what to write about as a writer, but you can't choose what you can breathe life into. So you're sort of stuck in a way with you're sort of stuck in a way with your material. And, and then you age and hopefully get smarter and your world expands and your material expands. So, the next project will be something different. But, and I think my first two books were quite different with similar characters. But, I'm not worried about being too narrow or pigeonholed or something like that. I think, as a writer, the advice I give to students is like, write what you can be authentic about and tell your story. Don't tell some bullshit thing that you saw on TV that you think is popular, right? What can you make? You only got one life to live and write about things. Why not write about what's important to you? So, good deal.
All right, we have a question over here.
Hi, my name is Catherine Powell. I'm in LaMarche's Approaches to Lit.
Hi.
I have two questions for you, actually. First, is there a deeper meaning behind your title for this collection? And what are the messages that you wish to convey to the public and your readers? And why did you choose this format to do so?
Good question. So the first question was, is there a meaning behind the title?
Yes.
Is there a meaning behind the title? The title comes from a short story that's in the book. And the short story is called "Add This to the List of Things That You Are," and it's sort of commonplace for short story collections that one of the stories in the collection would be the title for the book. Now, I did some arguing with the press about what the title should be, and I had a different title. My original title was one of the stories called "High Hope for Fatalists Everywhere," which I thought was sort of sardonic and irreverent and a little funny, like I tried to be. And the press liked this title. They thought it was a little edgier. But that story's in a list format, and so that's where the title came from. So I was happy enough with it, I think. And your next question was about a message?
What messages do you wish to convey to the public and the people who read your book?
Great question. I wish I had a message to convey to someone, but if I did, I'd be a politician, and I'm not. So I try to tell a story. I think a story is like any art form. It's like a painting. It's like you got a canvas, and you put some color on it, and you're like, oh, that color, what would go with that color? And then you put some other color next to it. So it's a composition, and you're trying to, any idea that you had to start with, maybe I have a big idea to give you a message. Pretty soon, then you're confronted with actually trying to make something that fits together, and the message goes, yeah. So I don't think, I suppose literature has messages for us embedded in the pages, but I feel like sometimes the characters have messages they want to convey, but I don't feel like I have a message to convey to anyone. I'm trying to tell a story that sounds good, and with interesting characters and some interesting things that happen, but I'm not
I'm not doctrinaire. I don't have a message for you. Sorry. Yeah.
How did you know you were done? How did you know that this was the number of stories that would make for a coherent collection?
How did I know this was the number of stories that would make a coherent collection? Well, I didn't have a particular number in mind. So, when you're a writer, you encounter books and you think, well, some writer wrote a book and then published that book as it came to them. And, really it's a more iterative process. You work with an editor and sometimes more than one editor, and they have opinions. So there was some horse trading with stories. Some of them were cut out. You can always count on editors disagreeing with each other. So people were arguing about which stories should stay. And two readers of this book, one reader said, my favorite story is this story, and the other one said the worst story is, and it was the same one. So people just don't agree. There's no accounting for taste. I think Charles Lamb said that. And so I didn't have an exact number of stories, but I write other stories besides what's in this book, and these were stories that I had that fit the theme that the editor was willing to put between hardcovers.
Do we have other questions in the audience? Oh, sorry.
What's that on your ball cap? I can't see very well with the lights.
It's the SUNY Canton logo.
SUNY Canton.
Are
you a baseball player?
Yeah.
Oh, did I get it right? I'm not a baseball player, so I was faking it through. Yeah.
Thank
you.
My name's Gokul. I'm part of Lamasha's Approaches to Literature class. You mentioned earlier about your first story and your last story sort of relating to each other. Is it difficult to bounce back between stories and settings and different characters and then have to go back to another one and then sort of continue that sort of realm, or is it in some ways easier to sort of bounce back?
Yeah, so good question. So the first story and the last story are related. They have the same main character, and then there are other stories in between. But I didn't write them in the order they are presented in the book. So I wrote them. The Cubness that I read is one of the more recent stories, and there's some of the stories that are older, but I don't have the order. So they were arranged more for aesthetic purpose than in the order that I wrote them. So I wasn't bouncing back and forth between stories as I wrote them. The first story and the last story, they're longer. They're kind of novella-length stories, and they were actually part of a novel project that I aborted, and ended up using them as stories. And so there's a chronology. The first story, looks at a period of the character's life when he's in the rural Midwest, and then he's sort of an outsider there. I read a lot about outsider characters who don't fit in because I feel like an outsider doesn't fit in, so I can relate to that. And then in the second story at the end, he's in an urban environment where he hoped to go and fit in, and guess what? Doesn't fit in there either. So, such is life. Good question. Thank you.
Oh. I don't know why I walked back over there. I felt like I had to balance the room out.
Will Fassinger, community member. Lousy baseball teams are lousy baseball teams. Why did you choose the Chicago Cubs as opposed to the Milwaukee Brewers? And was that to get the characters in that short story out of a comfort zone?
That's a great question. There's a line in that story that says that your allegiances in adulthood you're stuck with your allegiances in adulthood. I mean, most people go to the same denomination of church that they went to as a kid, and they root for the same team, and vote for the same politicians, whatever. And I grew up, and my dad was a Cubs fan, and so I got stuck with the Cubs, even though I'm a Wisconsinite, and so ideally I should be more of a Brewers fan. But I was stuck, just as you were probably stuck as a child with a team, and then it remains with you. I think there's a kind of, there's obviously a kind of childish appeal to sports. They appeal to us as children, and then we take that, we carry that childish sense of wonder through our lives. But in this particular story, I chose the Cubs because that was the team that
when I was a child, my dad had rooted for. And that image there of the Cubs being, seeing the Cubs in black and white, that was my my childhood. My dad always trying to sort of get the TV to come in, get the antenna to come in so that WGN would broadcast the game.
Well, and I would jump in also that having spent the last 13 years going to Brewers games at Miller Park, that story really couldn't have taken place at Miller Park because it is way too sanitary.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just there's Miller Park versus Wrigley Field, night and day.
Yeah, Miller Park, nice ballpark. You can see the Cubs for cheaper in Miller Park.
Yeah, that's why so many Cubs fans go up there.
Wrigley Field North, they saw it. Yeah.
Do we have other questions? Actually, along those lines, I had another question, and that. What do you think is the appeal of failure? It's interesting because I grew up a Red Sox fan, and lived and died with the Red Sox until they won the World Series, and now I'm happy when they win the World Series seemingly every other year, but they're much less interesting.
Yeah, who wants to root for a winner? Some people do, I guess. I like to root for the underdog. Maybe that's why there's not more traditional heroes in these stories, but. Yeah, the sort of striving and not quite making it. I'm a pessimistic, kind of fatalistic person, and so that sort of attraction to the underdog and the sort of, Sisyphus pushing the rock up the hill and coming back and crushing you. Yeah, so that's more appealing to me personally. That's my sensibility. Yeah.
All right, last chance from the audience. Going once, going twice. Well, I want to thank you, Chris Fink, and everybody else for being here tonight. Thank you so much. Congratulations on a terrific election, and hope we'll see you again.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And thanks from me for coming out. And if anybody would like to have a book signed, I'm sure Chris would be glad to sign a book up here front.